for the introduction. So here's what we're going to do today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that I've been working on immigration attitudes. Immigration was a big part of the 2016 presidential election in the US, and it's certainly going to play an issue in 2020. This isn't a talk right about 2020, but in Q&A, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have about the current political moment and how these kinds of issues or other issues would play out in the 2020 election. Okay? This won't be very long, but you can also feel free to ask me questions as we're going. This is part of a larger project I'm working on. And how's my volume in the back? You okay? Okay. So this is part of a larger project I'm working on with collaborators from Norway, Spain, Finland, and France on thinking about the ways in which, so as Lewis said, one of the things I'm interested in as a political psychologist is understanding how things like crises influence how people think and act politically. So the crisis we're really interested in this project is thinking about terrorism and how terrorism, particularly the Paris attacks of 2015, shaped how people in different democratic countries reacted to the crisis that came from these terrorist attacks. Okay. So in 2015, there were a series of terrorist attacks in France, the largest of which happens in December 2015, where there's a bombing at the Bataclan and there's shooting. And this is one of a series of several terrorist attacks that you see in France and Europe in this time period. Right? Some of them include trucks being used as weapons. This is the same time we have the Orlando shootings and the shootings in San Bernardino. What my co-authors and I are really interested in, as I said, is how in societies that have been touched by terrorism, those feelings of anxiety that come from, and the feelings of fear and anger that come from either directly experiencing or indirectly experiencing terrorist attacks, how that shapes attitudes about the people that you live in society with and people who are trying to come to your country, okay? So at the same time that we have these major terrorist attacks in Europe, we have the largest mass migration of people since World War II coming into Europe at this time. Most of whom are coming from fleeing the Syrian civil war, but we have other people coming from the Horn of Africa and from Afghanistan. We have more than 1 million refugees and migrants who are in Europe at this time. We know from previous work that immigration is an issue that makes people uncomfortable and angry, and there's a lot of disturbance in society when we have large mass migrations of new people. The people who are coming into Europe at this time are ethnically and religiously distinct from the majority native populations in Europe. Right, we're getting a mass migration mostly of Muslim immigrants, again, mostly who are ethnically distinct from many of the people, the kind of white natives who live in Europe. That's obviously not true everywhere. Europe is pluralistic in the way that the US is. Immigration plays a large role in the American presidential campaign in this time period in 2016, in the discussions of Brexit in the UK, and in the larger story of populism in Europe. So we are interested in, again, how these two, what are major shifts in society, both this kind of crises from terrorism and also, we don't need to call it a crisis from refugees and immigration, but this large societal change, how they are related. Right? Our current president in 2015 makes the connection between these two things, right? In December 2015, after the Paris attacks, then candidate Donald Trump said he was calling for a complete and total shutdown of Muslims entering the US until our representatives can figure out what's going on. And when he takes office in 2017, one of the first things he does in what will be a series of kind of closing the door on immigration or making immigration more difficult is he actually institutes an immigration ban on people coming from mostly Muslim countries. Okay. So What we argue in this project is that threats from terrorism, whether it's in your country or you're seeing it on television, increase your worry about terrorism. It's not always the case that we see something scary and we feel scared, but we think this is what happens in the realm of terrorism. When people are concerned about terrorism, we expect to see an increase for policies that people believe will protect them from danger. This is what happens when people are scared. They want policies that they believe will keep them safe. But in these countries that we're going to be looking at, so this is the US, France, Spain, Norway, and Finland. These are picked partially because, quite honestly, the Norwegian Research Council is the one who's funding us, so Norway is the case. We are also interested in, these are all countries who have experienced terrorism in various ways. Norway and Finland are what we call kind of high social trust, high social capital countries. These are places where people trust each other. And then we have Spain and Spain and the US, which were original cases who have both experienced terrorism of various forms. And then France actually becomes a case after the Paris attacks. And so we add France as a case because they're the people who experienced the terrorist attacks in Paris to begin with. Okay? We expect that people will support policies that will keep them safe, and the policies that the elites in these countries, the political leadership in these countries, argue will increase security are the kinds of ones like you hear Donald Trump talking about. That is, people are told that what will keep you safe from terrorist attacks is decreasing immigration, particularly when those immigrants who are coming into the country are seen as threatening on a cultural, economic level, like the Muslim immigrants who are coming to Europe are. We also think that terrorism is going to decrease trust in outgroups, meaning the outgroups that come either religiously, outgroups, or immigrants, okay? We may think, though, that that is not the whole story, that threat might have a differential effect by the political ideology of the respondent. Right, so it might be that conservatives are more sensitive to threat. We know that from previous work that conservatives tend to be more sensitive to threat and may be more skeptical of immigration and outgroups to begin with. We also know that at least when we have lots of evidence from Norway and after their 2011 terrorist attacks, that threat can also induce what we call a motivation to control prejudice. That is, it's not always the case that threat makes us distance ourselves from outgroups. When we have a society that says, no, everyone is part of the political community, we may actually get people to say, no, that instinct that I have to try and stay with my in-group isn't the right one. That we may want to be more broad in who we consider to be part of the political community. And it's also the case that elites on the left might prime this motivation to control prejudice more. And so we might see that the effects of terrorism might only happen for people who are conservative, and they might not happen for people on the left. That's a hypothesis. That's what we're actually going to test. We actually don't find a ton of evidence for that. Okay? Yeah.
Are you differentiating domestic terrorism from foreign sponsored?
We are. So it is true that the kind of terrorist attacks that have occurred in Norway and Finland are these domestic terrorist attacks that have come from the right, as opposed to terrorist attacks that are exogenous. They're from ISIS, Al-Qaeda. These are qualitatively different, and so we want to think about how they differ. I'm going to show you some experimental data, which turns out if you ask people to think about a potential terrorist attack, and we do vary whether or not it comes from a domestic terrorist or someone who's from the outside, it doesn't really matter. But we do want to think about whether or not these cases are actually comparable because their experiences are quite different. Thanks for the question. Okay, so how do we test these set of hypotheses that we have? We do a two-wave survey. So again, we have these 5 countries. After the Paris attacks in 2015, we go into the field and we do a survey of people in these 5 countries using Gallup's online survey panel. In December 2015, so this is about 3 weeks after the Paris attacks, we kind of hastily put together our survey and we send it out. We have 7,800 people across these 5 countries. And then in January 2017, we go back to 2,300 of those people. And then we have a new cross-section of 7,800 people in January 2017 that we ask questions of, okay? So in total, we have about 18,000 people who we've asked questions about their experiences after the Paris attacks, their attitudes about immigration, trust in outgroups. We have lots of questions. We're in the midst of writing all of this up for publication. Okay. So I just told you a little bit about why we have these different countries, but again, we have these basically 2 sets of countries. These are kind of high trust Scandinavian countries, which my Norwegian colleagues think of as like the ideal, right? Norway is lovely, it really is, but it turns out Norwegian respondents look exactly like American respondents in a lot of ways. The idea here is that in these high trust societies that trust in each other and trust in government might provide what they call a prophylactic against fear. That is, Norwegians and Finns just might not be as afraid as other people because they know that government will protect them. That turns out to be true. Norwegians and Finns are not as afraid about terrorism as the other people in the other country, but once they are afraid, they act in basically the same, attitudinally in the same kinds of ways, okay? So I'm just gonna, you don't need to worry too much about all the numbers here, but what I'm showing you here is we asked 2 sets of questions about how fearful people are across these countries. In 2017, that's the blue dots, and the gray dots, the gray diamonds here are 2015. So there's a couple of things. So there's Spain, Finland, France, Norway, and the US. There's a couple of things, and this is how worried you are, both about a future terrorist attack and about you or your family becoming a victim of terrorism. Okay, just 2 things to take away from here. The first is that 13 months, so concerns about a future terrorist attack and you becoming a victim of terrorism are pretty high in these countries. So the scale goes from 0 to 1. They're pretty high across all these countries. They're even high 13 months later. After there has been no more major terrorism in these countries, only France is an actual victim of the Paris attacks themselves, and yet there is a lot of fear across these countries. But like I said, in Finland and Norway, the levels of fear are lower than in the other countries. Those are the 2 big things, right? Lots of fear, it lasts for 13 months, and these 2 sets of countries are different. Yeah?
I may have missed this, I'm sorry.
No.
I just wonder where your recipients came from, how you targeted.
Right, so they're all parts of the Gallup panel. So these are all people who have access. So one thing to keep in mind, these are all people who have access to the internet, and they're taking surveys online for small incentives. They do try and target people who don't have internet access and try and get them to take the surveys as well. I should also say that all the surveys were translated into the local language, so we spent a lot of time developing these questions and making sure that they were in the proper language for the people who were taking them. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so we also ask these questions to get at people's immigration attitudes about things like, we ask questions both about immigrants as a group and refugees as a special category of immigrants, right? Refugees are a special category of immigrants who are fleeing violence in their home countries. They're not coming for economic reasons particularly, okay? So we asked this question about whether or not your country should stop accepting refugees. This is one of many questions we asked. I just want to show it to you as an example. So this is a 5-point scale, and you can see, again, there's variation. Norway does kind of stick out as more accepting of refugees. This is not what your country is doing. This is whether or not we should change what your country is doing. There's lots of support in France and the US for the country to stop accepting refugees. Now, again, we're interested in the relationship between these 2 things, how fearful you are of terrorism and your attitudes about immigration. This is very busy, but it's gonna, basically we ask a lot of questions about, again, whether or not we want to have stricter control of refugees using that question that I had, whether or not we have a series of questions that are asking about Muslims particularly. That is whether or not we should basically use the state against Muslims in a variety of ways, whether we want to tighten immigration, increase Syrian refugees, we want to integrate more immigrants. So all of these graphs have the same function, which is looking at your fear of terrorism, how it influences your support for these different immigration attitudes, and then this is by the country. So there's a couple of stories here, just basic takeaways. One is that the more, and so these are from models that also control for all the other things that we know influence people's immigration attitudes, their education, their gender, their income levels. We know a lot about all of these respondents. So this is just, what is the effect, controlling for all of that, what is the effect of being fearful on terrorism on your attitudes about immigrants? Okay. The basic story is, across all these 5 countries, the more fearful you are about terrorism, the more likely you are to want to control refugees, tighten immigration, and it slightly decreases your support for integrating immigrants who are already in your country. Okay, this is what we would have expected, but different than, again, what my Norwegian colleagues think. Norway doesn't stick out as particularly different. Even we're in this very high trust society that is an immigrant, that receives refugees. Norway is this red line here. They're pretty much overlapping, right? So we can tell a story about some of these, but the basic patterns across all of these places: more fear, less supportive of immigrants and immigration. Okay. So this is also just to show you that I have people's respondents I have 2,000 respondents who I have their measures in both 2015 and 2017. So every time I talk about work on anxiety and fear, people ask, how long lasting is it? What is the effect of being fearful about immigration on attitudes? I can show you, because I have these 2,300 people who we interviewed both in 2015 and 2017, I can show you that the effect of being fearful about terrorism in 2015 is a very strong predictor of your immigration attitudes in 2017. Okay? The effects of the fear of terrorism are extremely long-lasting, right? They last at least a year, which in politics is like a generation. That's a long time. Okay? And so I'll just show you one more thing, and then I'll wrap up. So we also have this expectation that that fear of terrorism may decrease support for outgroups. So we ask people in all of these countries, again, these dots are just by the different countries, but the story is basically the same, how much they trust different groups. So we have a bunch of groups. We ask people in your neighborhood, people in your country. We ask people how much they trust Christians as a group, how much they trust Muslims as a group, immigrants as a group. Again, I'm just showing you 3 of the many that we asked about. So again, the x-axis here is how fearful you are of terrorism, with higher fear being over here. So the more fearful you are about terrorism, here, the less likely you are to say, across all 5 countries, the less trusting you are of immigrants as a group. The less trusting you are as Muslims as a group. But it has no effect on your fear of Christians as a group. Okay? This isn't people's own identities. This is how much they say they trust these as a group. So what we're seeing here is that terrorism creates this fear. And the fear can be used in a variety of ways. In these countries, what we're seeing is that and the story I'm going to tell you is, when elites tell you that the way to stay safe is to keep your borders closed, that people support that. They agree with that on the whole. Now, I have some experimental evidence where I can tell you that, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I'm sure you have questions about other things, but that's normatively and some other things that I find. So I'm just going to give you the takeaway. So I always say I look very nice, but one of the things that I do in my work is I scare people about various things. And so in the 2017 version of this experiment, we scare people about terrorism. So we get them in the survey to read about a potential terrorist attack. And either the terrorist attack is going to be from an ISIS terrorist who, and we vary whether or not they were born in the country or they're an immigrant, or it's going to be from a right-wing group, and that right-wing group varies by the country that it's in. So here in the US, we use kind of anti-government groups, like we have out west. Okay. So basically what we find in this experiment is that it doesn't matter whether or not you read about, so I'll go back to here. It doesn't matter which group you read about, whether it's a immigrant terrorist, a refugee terrorist, or a right-wing terrorist. This is how fearful you are and how angry you are. You are reacting negatively to reading any story about potential terrorism. Okay? Makes you fearful. Okay, but what we find is actually it's not that right-wing respondents, and so these are more conservative respondents. I say right-wing because our like liberal conservative ideology doesn't map onto every country well. So right-wing, left-wing is how I'm going to talk about this. It's not that our right-wing respondents are more affected by our treatments, our experimental treatments about terrorism than our left-wing respondents. It's that they are already less supportive of immigration than left-wing respondents. And when you treat these left-wing respondents with these stories about terrorism, they say they become more trusting of Muslims, they become more trusting of immigrants. So they kind of do the opposite of what we might have expected. They become more trusting of basically all groups. So this is a little puzzling, right? That's my like little sad phase, trying to figure out what's going on here. And again, right-wing respondents move in the opposite direction, becoming less trusting, but their effects are pretty inconsistent across the different measures I have. So I'm puzzling through what is going on here with our right and left-wing respondents. Okay. One is, I think there's, again, this motivation to control prejudice that we see in our left-wing respondents. They know in this hypothetical case, I'm not supposed to be prejudiced, I'm not supposed to say bad things about other groups, and so I'm going to not accept this information. That might be it. There might also be that like left-wing respondents tend to be more likely to be in a political coalition with Muslims and immigrants. That might be part of it. I think it's this first one. It's quite possible our left-wing respondents just don't understand what we're trying to do, and I sometimes in experiments blame the respondents that they didn't know what I was trying to do. I don't think it's that. I think it's that threat might also be so politicized that liberals and left-wingers, when they read these treatments, might say, oh, I know what you're trying to do here, and I'm going to react against it. I think it's the first one. I have some evidence that it's the first one, but I'm still kind of puzzling through that. Okay. So again, I'm just going to wrap up by saying that what we see in these places, again, these places vary in both their experience with terrorism, how much social trust there is in places, but when people become fearful, right, they want more restrictive immigration, refugee, and integration policies. This affects both non-citizens. This affects both immigrants and people who are in the country already, and religious minorities. Now, these results seem to differ by ideology, but the larger project that this comes from is an attempt to understand what makes society resilient in the face of crises. And I don't think we've actually found that yet, certainly in this part of the project. I don't think like Be Norwegian is actually a solution to the problem that in pluralistic societies that have immigration, how do we become resilient when we have a threat to society, the security threat, right? It may be that these kinds of threats are a detriment to democracy because they make people less trusting of one another, and they also make it harder to govern, okay? So I'm gonna end there, and happy to take your questions about this or anything else. Yeah.
Hold on. Hold on. Firstly is, being exposed to this survey, this concept, this very pointed concept of how people are worrying about terrorism, I book it that none of you have thought about this. It's so intrinsically hardcore as we've experienced from Shana today. It's a concern, evidently in other countries, but in the conversations that I have with friends, nobody ever says to me, I'm worried about terrorism here in Syracuse, New York, here in Fayetteville, Manlius, and DeWitt. Never. So the question is, just from you to our audience, does that subject matter ever come up with your conversations with your friends and the people that you hang with? There you go.
So I shouldn't worry about, I mean...
No, I don't mean you shouldn't. I mean, but evidently the concept, this worry that you propagated here has not come down to this audience.
So possibly. So here's what I want to say. When you ask, you got to something that I think is important, which is the kinds of things that we ask about on surveys are, generally speaking, what is being talked about in politics at the time, right? So we go into the field in 2015 after there's been a large terrorist attack, and we ask people how worried they are about it, because that's what's happening at the moment. It may be that in our normal everyday conversations, these are not anything that you are worried about, that you're going to change your behavior about at this moment. If there were a terrorist attack, you would be concerned about it. This is the time in which we're asking people about terrorism. I will also say that I've been studying people's concerns about terrorism since 2003. And if you look at the polling on how worried people are about terrorism, or how likely they think a terrorist attack is in the next year, it's pretty steadily high over time. This is not, so maybe you all are not concerned about this, but if I asked on a survey how concerned people are about terrorism, it is surprisingly high since 9/11 to now. And it goes up when we have an event like a terrorist attack. And that doesn't mean that people always translate that concern into what they're going to vote for, their policy attitudes. But when it is salient, it does matter a great deal for the kinds of policies that people want their government to pursue. The reason you all take your shoes off at the airport all the time and have to go through a body scanner is because people are still concerned about terrorism, and it has been built into our government policies, and it is unlikely that it will be dismantled from policy, because the government faces much more incentive to securitize things because they pay a much bigger price when they are wrong about terrorism and security than they do when they are right and tell you, right? So I think it's right that you shouldn't be concerned about terrorism. The actual odds of being killed by a terrorist attack are very, very low. You're much more likely to get hurt by your own mattress. No, I'm not joking. John Mueller at Ohio State has all these books about it. It's called Overblown, about the risks of terrorism are extremely low. But that doesn't actually mean that our responses to it are wrong. They're not appropriate for the odds, but terrorism is also extremely scary, right? It has all these hallmarks of things that make people scared. It's out of control. It's covered a lot by the media. It's very it's out of your control, right? And it is perpetrated by people that we don't know, that we think of as different than us, right? So it has all of these hallmarks of things that make people very scared.
I agree. I don't hear people talking about fear of terrorism, but I think it has a lot to do with people's attitudes for anyone who's a little different than they are.
Sure. So, and the point is that people, the attitudes about groups may come, it may be that the attitudes about groups come first and then the reasons come later, right? So we don't like a group and then we come up with reasons why we don't like them. And a terrorism is a kind of an appropriate reason that we can come up with why we don't like the group. So it may also go in the other direction, yeah.
You seem to reference the Norwegian attitude on terrorism a lot, and I understand...
That's because they pay my salary, but yeah.
I understand that the terrorist that killed all those kids in Norway was Norwegian.
He was, yeah.
And he was a right-wing Norwegian.
That's right.
And so he was alone as well. He didn't have any additional people with him, and he's now in jail forever.
Right, although a lot of the I'll let you finish in just 1 second. So Breivik, who's the perpetrator in Norway, is alone. He is a right-wing attack, but he put out this manifesto that has been used by people since then in their own attacks, right, in New Zealand and others, yeah.
Well, my question is,
Yeah.
don't you think the Norwegians are looking at terrorism in a different way than the other 5 countries are, in that most of the terrorist attacks in those countries were perpetrated by outsiders?
So the question is, again, this is a question about case comparison, is do Norwegians, are they really a good comparison case to other places? Because the experience that they have with terrorism is this right-wing attack against these kids in Oslo. And the kind of experiences are qualitatively quite different. And so I do think this is a real question of like, is the Norwegian case really similar enough that we should make our theories based on there? And I don't think so, but part of it is trying to figure out that the Norwegian case provides an example of when societies can become resilient in the face of terrorism. In that, if you look at my Norwegian colleagues have a set of surveys after the 2011 attacks, and they find that people become more trusting of one another. They don't have kind of hate crimes after their terrorist attack. And so they wanted to think about what are the things that make societies resilient. And part of it is there was a concerted effort in elite rhetoric to talk about the political community as being very broad and wide, and including all of the groups that Breivik said are not Norwegian. And so to that extent, I think we can think about what are the things that elites say that matter for the ways in which we respond to terrorist attacks, even if the terrorist attacks are quite different. What I will say is that in this project, everyone is responding to the same act of terrorism, which is we're asking them about their responses to the Paris attacks. And so while I think theorizing from the Norwegian case, we want to think about what are the lessons we can learn from that, we are also testing whether or not, given the same event, how do people respond to it? Yeah.
You mentioned elites a couple times.
Sure.
Do you have an opinion about whether our elites in this country, for example, that wield enormous economic, political power beyond their numbers, have similar terrorism worries, or whether those elites are utilizing these fears to manipulate the populace in a way that advances or sustains the elite's own self-interest?
That's a whole series of questions, so I'm going to think about that. I know, I like it. Okay, so the question is, the first part of this question I take to be, how do elites shape public opinion? And so I'm going to take that part first, and then do they do that in such a way that is for the benefit of the populace, or is it for their own self-interest? I'm going to be able to say less about that second part, but I'm going to talk about the incentives they have. So the best theories of public opinion we have suggest that, in the way that Lewis suggested, that most people most of the time aren't thinking about politics. And so how do they decide what they think of, say, foreign policy or who to vote for an election? They rely on the elites mostly from their party, but also coming from news and others, to help them figure out both what's going on in politics and how they should think about it. So we know elites actually do matter a lot. And when I talk about elites, I'm talking about political party leaders, and as that's communicated usually through the mass media. We can think about different kinds of elites. I'm not really talking about oligarchs in that kind of way, but really like elites who are party leaders. So the question of whether or not elites are using fear to manipulate people, or they're using them to support policies that they want the populace to support, I think it's a harder one to peel out. right? So again, elites, people who hold party and power want to keep holding power, and they want to get reelected. Okay, so like as a baseline, people who hold office, people want to stay in that office, and they want to get reelected if they can get reelected. So how do they do that? They provide policies that both benefit the people in their constituencies and keep them safe at the same time. So there is this really big incentive, if you are an elite and you have this fear of terrorism, that you get people, that you support policies that will keep them safe. Could we also see that elites may use the fear of terrorism to get people to support their re-election when the fear of terrorism is not the most important normatively, or not the only issue that you care about? Sure. Do I think they do that for their self-interest? I think that's probably, like, I'm surprised, I'm actually, as a political scientist, not particularly cynical about surprisingly, about political elites. I think they do want to get reelected. I think that's what they care about the most. Do I think there are certainly political leaders who are doing things for their own self-interest? But I think for their pocketbooks, but I think that is a minority. I think for the most part, it's that elites want to get reelected. They want you to support policies that they support, and they will use the means of fear in order to do it. And it's not always fear about terrorism. It might be other types of fear as well. Climate change, that one's not used very much, but maybe it should be. Fear of, a couple of years ago, when I think the first talk I gave in the Manlius Informed Series, I talked about campaign ads. I love campaign ads. I'll come back at some point and talk about campaign ads. Campaign ads are all full of fear, right? So if you remember, like the Daisy ad from 1964, I mean, the Daisy ad is about the fear of nuclear annihilation. It literally has a nuclear bomb exploding, and then it says, like, vote for LBJ, right? I mean, it's like, vote for LBJ, you're gonna die in a nuclear bomb. It's not very subtle, right? The Reagan ad, the bear, which is like, you should be afraid of the commies, vote for Reagan, right? Like, we have a lot of evidence that political leaders use fear in order to get you to support policies that they support, to vote for them, to stay on their side in their coalition. Maybe sometimes to line their pockets, but I think that's a minority. But yeah.
Do you want to speak about the latest video that was aired at Mar-a-Lago?
Okay, so do I want to speak about it? I will speak about it. Okay. So I assume you're talking about there was a video that was produced. It's unclear who produced it, right? It was played at a conservative party meeting at it was in Mar-a-Lago or Doral or one of the Trump resorts in.
Yeah.
Okay, so there was a conservative party meeting in Florida at one of the president's estates. And there was a video that was produced that showed the president essentially mowing down people in a church, and the people in the church had the logos of news outlets, and also were some of his, what we might call, political rivals, right? So John McCain and other people. It's unclear who produced this. I mean, maybe someone knows. I do not know who produced it or how many people actually saw this, but it is getting a lot of concern because these kinds of videos glorifying violence against the media and political rivals are disturbing, right? Because democracy is about fights among ideas. And it is not about using violence to try and best your rivals. That is not how we maintain a stable democracy. And so the idea that there would be a group, unclear how close they are to the president, unclear whether the president actually endorsed this, that would support essentially the rhetorical use of violence, if not actual use of violence, against political rivals is quite disturbing. And I think we shouldn't forget that there has been political violence used against journalists, both at, right, so we're talking about shootings at the Capitol News in Annapolis, if it's not Jamal Khashoggi being killed in Saudi Arabia, right? Words are very powerful, and this kind of play acting of gun violence, I think, is very dangerous.
But he denies that, he said he didn't know anything about it. Of course, he says that about everything.
Right, so I think even if it wasn't endorsed by the president, the idea that these kinds of ideas are acceptable in a group that has close ties to the president is quite disturbing, particularly because I think we also shouldn't forget that there were people who were, there was a person who was sending pipe bombs, right, to people that the president has criticized on Twitter or in other ways. So there has been this use, even though it hasn't, right, thankfully hasn't been actually executed, that there has been the threat of violence against political rivals of the president since the beginning of this presidency. I do think that is important to keep in mind. There and then there, yeah.
You had a question?
I didn't get the note about orange. You should tell me next time. I'll wear orange.
The great pumpkin.
Yeah.
I have a problem with the word terrorism.
Sure.
Because it has become, and I don't know whether this is just the U.S., but when we see a mass murder, they'll say, we don't think it's terrorism. As far as I'm concerned, it's terrorism. But we've made a connotation that it's got to come from a different country or a religion or something.
Sure.
I would, if I got a survey and asked about terrorism, I'm more fearful of terrorism, domestic terrorism,
Sure.
than I am from the world.
Okay, right. So I think this is important when we talk about terrorism. All I mean by terrorism is using essentially what Martha Crenshaw, who's a political scientist, used, which is violence used against civilians for political purposes. Okay, so to the extent that we are seeing violence in society, so school shootings do not fall under the rubric of terrorism unless the shooter has a political purpose, and they indicate that either before or after or during.
But we must have changed that, because that's not what the dictionary says for terrorism.
So okay, so I think this is also the construction of what it means to be a terrorist attack in the news is also different, right? So domestic terrorism by domestic white supremacist groups or right-wing groups, this, if they are using violence against civilians for political purposes, falls under that rubric, okay? Now, what the media calls terrorism, it may be different, right? So Erin Kearns, who is a criminologist at University of Alabama, has a couple of really interesting papers where she looks at mass media and when Muslims are invoked in violence, it's much more likely to be called terrorism than when the perpetrator of violence is white, right? So the construction of the social meaning of terrorism as linked to Muslims in the US is different from what the actual federal definition of terrorism is. And that, again, right, the actual risk of being a victim of violence is more likely. There were more terrorist attacks by white supremacist groups in the last couple of years than they were by Islamic fundamentalist groups, right? So our construction of what is actually scary is not always linked to the actual numbers that are on the ground. But when I mean terrorism, again, all I mean is violence against civilians for political purposes. Yeah.
Now, I was curious about the demographic differences in the numbers that you presented. In other words, between men and women, between different age groups, different education groups.
Sure. So it tends to be the case that women are more likely to say they're fearful among all things than men, right? So we do see differences in fear. It tends to be the case that the more educated you are, the more supportive of immigration you are, right? So I'm not showing you any of that data, but that's just kind of the general trends What was the other group that you asked about?
Education, age.
Age. Again, age is more, that one I haven't looked at. I do control for age, but I don't know that there's really big differences across the groups on age, but that's a good question. Yeah.
So you said you used exposure to a potential terrorist event to see how that influenced your study. You did that, right?
Well, we asked people after the Paris attacks how worried they were about terrorism, right? Whether or not they'd actually been a victim, that we asked them about how fearful they were of becoming a victim, yeah.
Okay, so there really wasn't any construct that you could use to present them with information, that statistical information that proves that immigration is actually beneficial to a society.
Right, so we were not trying to kind of correct misinformation, right? So it is the case that people, right, that there is a perception that immigrants make places less safe, that they bring crime. These are misperceptions, right? When immigrants come into neighborhoods, the neighborhoods tend to become safer. There tends to be less crime. There's all sorts of reasons why that might be. But we were not trying to correct that misinformation. What we were trying to do is seeing whether, when people become fearful, do they, what's their attitudes about immigration? Yeah.
Right, but I'm just saying there wouldn't be any logical way to construct something to plug into your survey.
Sure, I mean, we could, if we wanted, tell people within the survey, right, how fearful you are of terrorism, and then ask them about their immigration attitudes, and then tell them, by the way, immigrants actually decrease crime and they don't bring terrorism. But what we're interested in is, in the political world where we're talking about terrorism, how does that influence people's attitudes without that correction? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The word terrorism includes that word terror.
Sure. That's the purpose of it.
It also includes the word terrified. Not to make a broadcast of this, but how many people in this room are terrified every day they walk out of their door that something's going to happen to them? I venture to say none. Otherwise you wouldn't go. So you're not terrified.
Sure.
So you're living in a world, hold on, Paul. So you're living in a world, or a section or a part of the world that is not terrified.
How can it be?
Say again?
Sure we're terrified. You get out on the road, you get terrified.
That's a different, I was just talking about going out and getting the mail. Going out for a ride, get out.
Lewis doesn't get terrified going out and visiting, nor do I. But there are a lot of people who live in places, neighborhoods in the city, such as the near North Side route that I deliver Meals on Wheels in, who do live in fear, who have their doors locked all the time. And as I deliver, I see this amazing variety of ethnicities that are living in that area, many of whom are wearing a native garb, and a lot of recent refugees, immigrants-led refugees, come from Africa, come from South America, come from various countries in Asia, and they are not the historically accepted immigrant groups from Northern Europe or wherever. And so I guess my question relates to, is there any study that demonstrates or shows that there is a significant likelihood that these new groups, which look so much different from the majority, will successfully assimilate? I know the studies show that there's less violence amongst them. Most of the time, they come here for opportunity and seize that opportunity, get educated, kids come in. And so a lot of the fear related to them is unwarranted. But I get the impression that a lot of people who don't know any of these people, don't have any contact with these people, are fearful that these people are just coming here to exploit our system and will not actually ultimately assimilate.
That, when you go into that neighborhood after 5 o'clock at night in January,
Yeah, I don't do that. It is daylight.
then I understand. So there is an element of terror in your mind. Okay? You're worried that something's going to happen to Tom Bassett because of the word terror. You're walking in there somewhat terrorized.
This is a different form of terror. There's violence in those.
Oh yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Great, so, okay, so is it, let me think about how to answer that question. So the first set of things I would say is there is a huge literature both in the US and Europe about attitudes about immigration and what is the structure of them and what makes people more or less supportive of immigration. And all those things that you noted of people being concerned about assimilation, people being concerned about immigrants taking jobs, and them being different, right, ethnically, religiously, and can they become American? Can they become French? Those are a lot of the determinants of when people express anti-immigrant attitudes or attitudes where they want to limit immigration. Those are all the concerns when I have. I'm sorry, this is mine. When I ask people on surveys to tell me what makes them concerned or makes them fearful about immigration, these are all the kinds of things that they say. They also mention language, right? So a lot of the concerns in the U.S. are really about Spanish as a language, and where are barriers. There is this whole literature about that immigrants do assimilate, and that they bring economic benefits to the places that they go to, and that there are better outcomes for their kids in terms of health and education than they would have been, and even that there might be for natives who look similar to them on lots of dimensions. I'm not sure that that's very convincing for people. I don't know that showing people that, yes, immigrants assimilate, they do fine, is really the key. I think the thing that you said that is relatively key to getting people to think, even if they don't say we should have more immigrants, to say that immigration is okay, is the contact, right? And I think that contact is really important because it builds empathy. But how you get that contact between different kinds of groups is, again, a challenge in thinking about how you bring people together. We have a lot of work to say that the more contact you have with different kinds of groups, the more open you are to conversation, the more open you are to working together, and the more it builds empathy. But people also choose into contact, right? And so how we tease apart whether it's the kinds of people who want to work together with different groups or it's the contact itself is tricky. But I do think the contact, right, delivering Meals on Wheels, those kinds of things with you, having real conversations with people who are different than you is the key to getting, if you want to convince people that immigrants are okay, immigration is okay, that the contact is that really important piece. Yeah.
I think, excuse me, I think we tend to be ethnocentric to begin with.
Sure.
I think there are a million white neighborhoods that you're not going to walk into after 5 o'clock without some concern. And I think what we get may have something to do also with how these groups are treated once they're here by those who are already here without regard for race or ethnicity or anything else in the current population.
Sure, so the point was that ethnocentrism, that is believing that your group is better than other groups, is part of the reason, part of people's immigration attitudes, and we have lots of evidence for that as well. Don Kinder and Cindy Kam, they're political scientists, they have a book all about ethnocentrism and the ways in which it shapes both actually attitudes about immigration and attitudes about terrorism. It's called Us Versus Them. It's a very good book. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't really think that local terrorism is on the back burner so much. You can't turn on the 6:30 news and not see something about terrorism, be it local, be it, it's there all the time.
So I think local news has a lot to do with why. So I think the media environment has a lot to do with why people are maybe not in this area, but are as concerned about crime as they're concerned about terrorism as they are. Because again, there's incentives for the media to get you to tune in and watch. And one of the ways they get you to tune in and watch is tell you about the next thing that's going to kill you, right? Like, I mean, if you think about local news, one of the local news stations has like a segment called Fugitive of the Week, right? Like, really? Syracuse? Fugitive of the Week, right? The idea
You're
that...
kidding.
No, I'm not kidding.
I know you're not kidding,
Yeah.
but it's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, but the idea is that the world is really, really scary, and you should tune into us to tell us how to keep you safe, right? That's essentially what they're doing, is they like, right? So it's not only politicians who manipulate you to get you to support their things, right? The local media, not just local media, mass media does this also.
Well, the 6:30 news is the national news that I was referring
Right.
to.
I did, some people might think this is a weird thing that I did, but actually, I don't have a television. I listen to NPR, so I get a lot of stuff from there.
Sure.
And also my iPhone, I get a lot of news. So anyway, I found out about this guy that was hanging out near Skinny Atlas, and I know someone who lives out there, elderly gentleman. Because he was seen in the area. So this was on the news. So I called him up and I said, talked to him about locking all his doors and everything. And I had to wait on the phone. I said, now, did you lock X door? Oh, okay, I'll go do that. Because he just was, but I was concerned about it. And they did capture the guy the next day by the Skinny Atlas Country Club.
Oh, right, this was a escaped convict.
Right, yeah.
Not just any random guy.
But, I mean, there's just so many things that are happening. And I don't know,
Don't leave your house.
Right, no, I mean,
Stay home.
I think the thing is, right, the world is actually a lot safer than it used to be, right? The world is actually, generally speaking, quite safe. But it is the case that there are issues of importance that are also about things that that might harm you. And one of the major jobs of government is to keep you safe from harm. And so to the extent that we think about what kinds of issues government should care about, they do focus on those issues that have to do with safety more than other issues, even though there are lots of issues that matter, right? And how we get people to pay attention to those other kinds of issues, I think is also an important question.
So what was the goal of the folks, the Norwegians, in doing this particular study?
Well, one is we really want to understand how societies react to terrorist attacks, right? We want to, right, we're not policymakers, so we are not giving policy solutions to how government should react. We are researchers interested in understanding how the mass public, when they are faced with a crisis, what kinds of policies they want, and thinking about what are the kinds of things that they want, and then policymakers can figure out how to give that to them, or whether or not those are the right policies at all.
Thank you.
Shannon.
Yes.
Hold on.
Okay.
Well, I'll let you go first, but let me get this up. This subject matter that we are discussing, harboring, do you think in the White House today they are thinking about this subject matter as it pertains to the election that's really going to be juiced up after May 1st?
So, okay. So one of the things that that I haven't mentioned, because this is a comparative project, is when we think about choosing between parties. Okay. The parties have what we call issue ownership. The parties are considered to be better on some issues than others, right? And so to the extent that elections are about those issues that the parties are seen to be good at, that tends to benefit the candidate from that party. So in 2016, I don't know if you remember this, but Trump's acceptance speech at the RNC was essentially about how the world was on fire and how dangerous the world was and how he alone could keep us safe, right? Because well, make us great, all that business. Because the Republican Party has been seen for many decades as better on issues of security and issues of defense. And so to the extent that you are a party that you want to be fighting on the issues that you're seen as better on. So do I think the White House is thinking about how to be on these terms? Absolutely. I think the White House wants the 2020 election to be about immigration and the wall, and I think they want it to be about keeping us safe, because those are issues that the Republican Party is seen as better on. Even regardless of whether or not you like the president's particular kinds of policies, he ran in 2016 on immigration. Immigration attitudes have changed since 2016. They are much more supportive of immigrants and immigration in a what we call a thermostatic way, right? So we've seen what the policies look like when we have a kind of we close the border, and we've seen a lot of protesting. We've seen overall attitude toward immigration actually become more positive since 2016. But I do think that the White House is absolutely thinking how to fight 2020 on these terms.
Fight within 2020.
Fight across parties on 2020. I don't think they want it to be about Ukraine. They don't want it to be about economic. They want it to be about economics also, right? But they don't want it to be about climate change or health care. Those are not the issues that benefit this president or the Republican Party.
Have there been any studies about the effect on the advancement of society as a result of terrorism?
The advancement of society?
Because we give so many resources to security issues since 9/11. And that must have an impact economically.
Right, so that's a really good question about what are the economic impacts, right? Because we spend a lot of money on the Department of Homeland Security, could we be spending that money on other things? I think is a good question. I haven't done that study. I think John Mueller, who I mentioned before, has a couple of books on what he sees as kind of the wasteful money and time and energy spent on Homeland Security. So I would go and look at his books. There are economists who work on issues of terrorism, Esteban Klor at Hebrew University. There are a couple of people who do that kind of work. I have not, but John Mueller would be my suggestion, yeah.
On just a very personal level, what you're talking about, our synagogue has to have 5 security people during the Jewish high holidays. We've never had that before. That's an economic burden.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
That kind of thing.
Sure.
And we're not the only synagogue. I mean, the Jewish Community Center.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, there are certainly...
That's a prevention issue.
Yeah, but
right, but it comes...
But it has to do with terrorism.
dealing with terrorism.
Yeah,
Right.
for sure. Yeah.
That doesn't mean you shouldn't turn Jewish, just means that's what's going on in the synagogue.
I just think it's very ironic that the man, you're saying, and I'm sure that Trump would agree if you just asked him, is this really important? But on the other hand, we're talking about the man who encourages violence in every tweet he sends out. And encourages
Say that, I
violence.
want you to say that 40 times a day
I do.
on the internet, all the time. Because if you believe that and willing to say that in this room, there are tons of people in this world that believe it. Read the Washington Post, read the New York Times. They believe it.
I read a lot.
Excuse me for getting so enthusiastic about that point.
And it isn't just about maybe terrorism from other groups or something like that, but I mean domestic stuff. I mean he encourages all the wackos out there who aren't happy, and so they decide they're going to blow a school up. Or how about if he would spend as much time on mental health issues, which of course that would be ironic since he seems to have one himself.
I'm not a psychologist, I just play one on TV, so I'm not going to actually diagnose the president. But I do think you want to pay attention to what are the grounds in which the 2020 election is going to be fought on, and then also make demands. If you have candidates that you like, that you want them to be talking about issues, you should ask them questions. You should be pressing them on issues that you care about. If they're not talking about climate change, or they're not talking about education policy, or they're not talking about mental health, you should ask them to talk about that, right? You send them a note, you call their office, right? These are things, if you care about policies and you see that they're talking about things that you don't care, that are, in your mind, unimportant, that means that they haven't heard from your voice to say, like, I need you to talk more about X, Y, Z.
Just hold on. I will guarantee you that the guys who are talking to the people who are up for election for county attorney and district attorney and whoever, just at the local level, they're going to come out and say, I was at this meeting and they talked about terrorism. Or I was at this conference and they talked about terrorism. Sooner or later, that's going to enter into their political talk. Because if they locally can say, we're going to protect you from terrorism, you might vote for that person more than the person who didn't talk about protecting you.
This is not just so we're clear, this is not a campaign endorsement about what you think your candidate should be talking about, right? This is the kind of stuff that I'm interested in as a researcher. I don't necessarily think that these are, right, that you should be voting on the basis of these things, but they are, terrorism and immigration are major policy issues that are in the political agenda, and I'm interested in how they go together. Right? So,
I not only think they're on the agenda, but you can't tell me they're not. When these guys got at 9 o'clock in the morning, they say, this is what I heard. This is a subject matter that's concerning. Whether it be terrorism, immigration, or climate control, or whatever the Michigan is. But don't tell me they don't talk about these things in their meetings.
oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, for a lot of people who don't know enough to distinguish between different groups of foreigners who come here, they kind of lump together legal and illegal immigrants, refugees, and others. And the bulk of, and with respect to refugees now, it's my understanding that the Trump administration has ordered that I think the next year's quota of refugees be reduced to 18,000. So that's being cut back, thereby resulting in fewer refugees flowing to places of resettlement in this country. Interfaith Works, which locally here does a lot of support for refugees, has almost nobody to service practically anymore. And we're losing the infusion of those people who are basically non-threatening. So where do you think things are going to move to?
I mean, I think the Trump administration has been very clear from the time of the election that that the immigration policy of this administration is to make immigration more difficult and to reduce the number of both undocumented and legal immigrants. They have made some changes in the administration of visas that have made it harder to get foreign workers. all of the stuff that's going on at the southern border, meaning that asylum seekers now have to wait in Mexico. There's something like 20, there's thousands of people waiting at the border in Mexico who are trying to seek asylum. Asylum is legally protected by international law. The asylum, refugees are seeking asylum, meaning they are fleeing violence and political persecution in their home countries, and they are trying to do that in the US. So seeking asylum is legal. The administration has had broad leeway, according to the Supreme Court, in how they administer that asylum policy and immigration policy. So what do I think we'll see? I think we'll see a continuation of the kinds of policies that we've seen thus far. The Trump administration has, again, they ran on making immigration harder to do, and making asylum, essentially we're going to get no asylum. I mean, 18,000 is a drop in the bucket, right? In terms of when I say like there are 1 million people refugees in Europe right now, the new armed conflict that is now going on in northern Syria is likely to drive more people into Europe, and some of those by older law might have ended up in the U.S. With asylum, in seeking asylum in the U.S., but that's very unlikely at this point. So I think that's likely what we'll see with this administration. What we will see with another administration is less clear, but I think you would probably see an increase in the same ways you said if we have a Democratic administration that comes in 2021, you would see an increase maybe to the levels that the Obama administration. I haven't heard a lot from the Democrats on this, but a lot of the Democrats who are running for the nomination now are running on making immigration easier rather than harder. So I think we would see a difference.